So let's see. People are still coming. Yes, people are coming in. I can start the meeting off, considering that it's already gone 6 o'clock now. So welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming to this meeting. First of all, I would like to. I think certainly considering the topic, I think it would be very appropriate to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we're meeting, and I'd like to pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging. And in the case of Melbourne, where I sit, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So welcome everybody. This meeting was sparked off by a discussion of the Fair Data Maturity Model Group and the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group. So as both groups were starting to do our work and we're puzzling about ways of assessing either the fairness of data or how care data is, or how care, according to the care principles, how data is treated. We realized there were actually some quite a number of mutual interests and experiences wanted to learn from each other. So we decided that it would probably be good to organize a session, originally of course planned here in Melbourne. That didn't work out, so we've now decided to continue it, because we really did want to continue this conversation, but then in the virtual form. So I'm here just to kick it off and to do a quick welcome. But the meat of the meeting will come after this, and we'll be talking about, first of all, the experiences that the working group, the Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group, ran into as we started to develop the indicators, and we're exploring with the community how to assess things. Then we'll have an introduction to the care principles and how the work that's been done there and the principles behind that, and have a further discussion around care in the context of scientific data and application of care in that context. And we'll also have a perspective and a bit of a puzzle around what does fair mean in the context of Indigenous data, and does it, or do we need extra views there, do we need extra perspectives there? And then we'd like to close off with a provocation and a discussion. So what would a careful process look like if you want to operationalize both care and fair? How would those two work together? So I'd like to welcome all the other co-chairs, obviously, from the Fair Maturity Model Working Group and the care, the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group. And I think the first person to kick off, Maui, are you there for as co-welcome and introduction?
Sure. Kia ora everyone. My name is Maui Hudson. I'm from the Whakatōhea tribe in New Zealand, and I was one of the co-founders of the Te Manararaunga, the Māori Indigenous, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, and that's one of the founding groups that have helped found the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So I know we're really pleased to be able to be working in with the Fair Data Maturity Group and see these conversations as being really complementary. I did just want to add also my acknowledgements as well. It's an interesting thing when we have meetings in a place and we can acknowledge, do our land acknowledgements to that place. And now that we're in this sort of doing it from our own homes, what does it mean to acknowledge the places where we live all of the time? So I think that's important, and also in the context of this discussion where we're thinking about what those identities and associations look like in the context of data, which is moving around all the time. So what does it mean to think about acknowledgements to the communities that are affected by the data we work with? So it's really I think this COVID environment is making us think about things in a slightly different way, and it's an opportunity for us to think about that as well. Next slide, Stephanie. So just a little bit of background to the thinking that's been happening with the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. It was a network that was put together really to promote Indigenous control of Indigenous data, and that was strongly building on the discourse around Indigenous data sovereignty. So advancing those ideas, and ones around what Indigenous data governance look like, how we assert or how we start to articulate and then assert Indigenous people's interests, rights and interests in the context of data as well. Particularly so it can be used to support their well-being. Listening to Kathy in the RDA plenary yesterday, talking about some of the work that's happening around COVID, and we think about how data contributes to well-being and decisions that get made around people, situations at the moment, but also they're being helping us develop the way we'll approach things in the future as well, and how that needs to be balanced with both from an Indigenous point of view. I've seen feeds coming through around people wanting to make sure that there's appropriate ethnicity data associated with this information being generated, so we can look at issues of equity that might be arising as the pandemic plays out, as well as the sorts of tools that are being put in place to help us track cases and where they end up, and what that means in terms of as a surveillance tool, which has a great application in the context of the pandemic, but people are already expressing concerns about what other uses that tool might have in the future. And so, all of these conversations and all these thoughts are happening at the same time. And so to what degree can communities or Indigenous communities be a part of those sorts of decisions? The secondary use, the other uses, so that the way that these things are operationalized in the future are both fair and clear. Thanks, Stephanie. So Indigenous data sovereignty is really the right of Indigenous people and nations to govern the collection, ownership and application of their own data. And it derives from rights that emerge from some inherent rights which they associate with place and the places they're from and the things that happen in those areas. So as it relates to their people, their lands and the resources. It has its genesis in the traditions, roles and responsibilities for the use that the community, or how the community held that information and would share that information. And I think there's part of this, part of the transition from into a digital environment where that information can now be more widely shared, starts to change the nature of the protocols which you would normally use to protect or manage that information in an appropriate way. And it shifts as you sort of move that information into a larger societal context. It's also positioned around the notion of human rights or Indigenous rights and the treaties that exist between nation states and tribal nations, and also connects with the philosophy, sort of a philosophy where knowledge belongs to the collective. And so its use has to be done for the benefit of the collective, but also the collective, there have to be different ways where its use can also be accountable to collective, given that it's not everyone using all the information all the time or making decisions about it. So how that accountability is built into the mechanisms of governance and use ends up being important. Thanks, Stephanie. So when we're talking about Indigenous data, what are the things that we're talking about? Covers a broad range of areas. At one level, it's about data about resources in the environment, so the association that people have with traditional territories and lands. It's about information of those the individuals of those Indigenous communities. And often that information is information that's being generated by agencies, social services, medical practices, all of those bits of data become personal data around which people can consent for use in different ways. But there's also an assertion by the tribal groups themselves that the aggregated data of their members is something they should have access to and be able to use to make decisions about the well-being of their people. And then there's data about the nations themselves, whether that's Indigenous knowledge, histories, literature, stories, that sort of information that talks about them as a nation and their identities is also comes under this sort of broad church of Indigenous data. Thanks, Stephanie. And so there's this relationship between the assertion of our right, the assertion of rights and interests, which is made as Indigenous data sovereignty, and then what can be done about that in the context where we live, where data is generated in a whole lot of places. It sits under the stewardship of a range of different agencies. It gets aggregated into places where then other people have either control about the access to it, or it becomes an open pool which anyone can access. And so shifting the thinking from the assertion of the right into how can we be involved in decisions about the use moves it from sovereignty conversation into a governance one. And you'll see here, in the context of Indigenous data sovereignty, two of the key themes have been around getting access to data for governance. So how do you access data so you can make better decisions in the interests of your nation, and also the governance of data, so that when data becomes accessible to a broader range of people, that you have the chance to be involved in decisions about access to that information by third parties as it relates specifically to your, I guess, tribal interests. So that was the kind of the general things that we're thinking about when we've been talking about Indigenous data sovereignty in the general sense. So that's my bit of an intro overview to that, and I'll pass it on to the next stage of the presentation.
Hello, everybody. I'm Shelly Stahl. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group, and I am on the other side of the world, and I want to acknowledge the land that I am standing on. It is both the Menahoic territory, traditional territory, and the Piscatawny traditional territory, which I am delighted to share with you, and very honored to be here. The work of the Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group is actually coming quickly to our first set of recommendations, and there'll be an opportunity for everyone to review those. And I just want to give you a summary of where we are right now. Stephanie, if you could go ahead. So hopefully most of you are familiar with FAIR. I won't go into that. That's that others have laid that groundwork. And one of the things that we've all come to fairly quickly is the fact that there is some ambiguity and a wide range of interpretation depending on your point of view, how you come to data, what your role is. And there are a number of existing assessment methodologies with a variety of ways to measure and calculate and to have these metric definitions. And we're all fairly engaged and excited to move in a direction together, but yet many of us are kind of not walking in lockstep yet. And this is one of the reasons the working group came to be, to come up with a way to compare across the assessment methodologies that are out there a common set of indicators and measurements so that we actually could still have our own unique assessment methodology, but the way we measure would be similar using this framework. So we brought a bunch of stakeholders together, took a look at the existing criteria that were out there, and came up with, had goals to determine if there could be a core set, if there could be a common model and tool set that could be used, and leading eventually to a recommendation to RDA. Next slide, please. So before we get too far along, it's important to talk about the fact that fair is not open and open is not fair. And there is, your data can be, and I take this from a publication from Rosie Higman, Daniel Bangard, and Sarah Jones just this last year, because I think they depicted it really well within the graphic and the way they've described it. But your data can be fair or open or both or neither. Certainly, the easier it is to find, meaning open, and the more closely aligned it is to fair, it has a higher probability of actually being reused and understood and support your work in as robust a way as possible. But it does not have to be open to be well documented, and it does not have to be well documented to be open. So certainly for the FAIR working group, we encourage data to be open, but because that's not part of the FAIR guiding principles, we do not require it as one of those criteria. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this as it applies to CARE as we go forward. And you've all heard that data should be as open as possible, as closed as necessary according to the type of data that you have. Next slide, please. And to dig in just a little bit more, even open has a bit of a continuum. And I pulled this off of one of the LibGuides at the University of Sydney, and it may also be in other locations, but you could have open data, data that is embargoed for a period of time to eventually be open, data that requires you to demonstrate that you are an appropriate researcher to gain access to some level of protection, and then data that's fully protected, perhaps it's proprietary data, which makes it challenging in publication if you're not able to have access within peer review process to evaluate science, the research that's being presented. But you can be all the way along this continuum, and we could probably even add more. Alrighty, next slide. So as we're, the work of the working group has progressed, starting initially with what does it mean to determine fairness? What would those indicators be? Could we possibly have guidelines and checklists? Would we have core criteria? And moving towards a final recommendation, and certainly getting feedback from the community who's incredibly engaged with FAIR, and we want adoption, and from which we want adoption, and for this to work across multiple domains. This was the series of tasks we were looking at. Next slide. So it's also important to see what we didn't do and had no intention of doing. This was out of scope. We weren't going to develop an evaluation method. That was not the remit. We were not going to define how the core criteria would be evaluated. We wanted to identify what would be evaluated. So it really is a framework for existing evaluation methodologies. And we were taking the FAIR principles as they were. Many of us have seen opportunities to extend, and even this conversation will look into collaborative ways that care and fair can work together. But we were taking fair as is with no adjustments. And on the next slide, what you would likely see, there we are, thanks. And this we call it the state of play, thanks to the folks that we're working with on our team. We've walked through the definition. We've done 2 phases of development. We just recently finished out testing, which went really, really well. And we're starting to create those final products. Next slide, please. So you can see that we had initial pilot testing and with several folks that gave us some initial feedback at the end of last year. And coming into this year, we had 9 tests with, sometimes we had multiple people on each test, which gave us some really robust content that came back. And all of that is just about finished being adjudicated. Our last working group meeting, which was just, I think that was last week, guys. It's a little fuzzy right now, time. And that's now being incorporated, and we're getting ready to propose the recommendation. Next slide. And this is a quick summary of that, what I've just talked about with just these last months laid out coming into April and May and June. And you'll see our next workshop, which you're all invited to come to, is coming up on May 20th and 21st. Next slide. Here are the links to all of the current working documents from the working group. Those that are being reviewed, just finished being reviewed right now, are down under the indicators prioritization and the survey results and coming into the guidelines if you're interested in taking a look at how those are progressing. And certainly if you want to be on the mailing list, there is the email at the very bottom. Next slide. Thanks. Keith or Edith, is there anything in addition that you would want to add to the conversation?
No, thanks, Shelley. I think that was a great overview of where the working group is at present. Thanks.
Maybe only to say that our last survey will end tomorrow. So if anyone is interested to the last survey, just visit our GitHub page and reply to the questions which are open. The deadline is tomorrow midnight at the Central European time. So you have a day to go.
One thing to remind folks of is the importance of machine readability and actionability coming out of the FAIR principles. And during many conversations within the working group, we really struggled with you were machine actionable or you weren't, because as people have tried to move their work towards being more fair, they needed more steps along the way. And so we have within our indicators a way to demonstrate progress towards machine actionability. And I just want to highlight the fact that it's acknowledging our human need to make incremental progress as opposed to a machine need to either do it correctly or not do it correctly. And that's one of the interesting connections with the very human orientation for the CARE principles. So maybe that's a good segue to the next section.
That's a perfect segue. Thank you, Shelley. So Sidak Atna Kastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll. I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm Atna from the native village of Kluti-Ka in Alaska. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Tohono-O'odham Nation and the lands of the Passamaquoddy tribe, on which the University of Arizona sit here in Tucson, Arizona. So I'm going to speak to you broadly about the CARE principles, and noting that they emerge out of concerns about secondary use of data and limited opportunities for benefit sharing and really honed in and focused attention on the tension that Indigenous communities feel between protecting Indigenous rights and interests in traditional knowledge and Indigenous data, while supporting or being subject to open data, machine learning, broad data sharing, and big data initiatives. And the articulation of Indigenous peoples' rights and interest in data about our people's lands, communities, cultures, territories is part of reclaiming control of data, data ecosystems, data science, and data narratives in the context of open data and open science. So under these pretenses, the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group at the Research Data Alliance began looking at what data principles already existed out there. And so we put together principles that had been put forth from some of our nation state-based Indigenous data sovereignty networks. So you see those here coming out of New Zealand, Australia, the US, and Canada, as well as some mainstream principles such as the Open Data Charter principles, the FAIR principles, and then stream properties for industrial and commoditized data. And really began to engage with what the principles were coming out of those different areas. And one of the things that you noticed, and which Shelly alluded to, is that we really pulled from the mainstream principles these really focus on data and how the attributes of data. And then when you begin to look at the principles put forth by Indigenous data interests, you begin to see this real focus on especially people as well as purpose. And then there's some overlap, but not a lot between them. And so when we began to think through in our workshop, what we wanted to focus on in creating those principles, we really wanted to hone in on the people and purpose aspects. And so in 2018 at the RDA P12 in Botswana, we hosted a workshop to begin thinking through what Indigenous data sovereignty principles for the governance of Indigenous data would be. And through those, the CARE principles emerged. So CARE focuses on 4 main principles with sub-principles in the same way that FAIR does. And so we focus on collective benefit in terms of data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from data. And we think about that in terms of for inclusive development and innovation, for improved governance and citizen engagement, and for equitable outcomes. Indigenous peoples' rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognized and their authority to control, which is the A in CARE, such data respected. Indigenous data governance enables Indigenous peoples and governing bodies to determine how Indigenous peoples, as well as Indigenous lands, territories, resources, and so on, are represented by and identified within data. This principle recognizes rights and interests that Indigenous peoples hold, and underscores what Maui had talked about earlier in terms of this twin and need for data for governance, but also to enact governance of data. Responsibility speaks to how those working with Indigenous data have the responsibility to share how that data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. And accountability requires meaningful and openly available evidence of these efforts and the benefits accruing to Indigenous peoples. This principle really speaks for positive relationships, for expanding capability and capacity within Indigenous communities, and for Indigenous languages and worldviews. The final principle of ethics talks about how Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem. And this looks towards minimizing harm and maximizing benefit, justice, and future use of data, and thinking about all of those at all stages of the data lifecycle. And I'm going to close here by saying that the people and purpose-oriented CARE principles reflect the crucial role of data in advancing innovation, governance, and self-determination among Indigenous peoples, and the principles complement data-centric approaches available through the FAIR principles, for instance, and really acknowledge that the principles build upon the earlier work of our Indigenous data sovereignty networks and our allies within RDA and elsewhere.
Thanks, Stephanie. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we've been thinking about in terms of implementation. So we've had really positive feedback around the care principles and the complementarity that they have with the FAIR principles. But we're at a different stage in development as opposed to FAIR, and you saw that presentation from, or that overview from Shelly talking about where they were at in the FAIR maturity data cycle. And as they move towards the end of that process, we're sort of right at the beginning of it. So starting to think about how do we move from having developed the principles into what does that look like in practice. Thanks, Steph. And so just as I was mentioning, or has been mentioned a few times now, there is this complementarity between FAIR and CARE, and also an overlap as we've been having these conversations, not only with the FAIR implementation group, but also the implementation working group for the Open Data Charter principles. And just trying to see what the alignment between different initiatives is and where that starts to push things. And I thought it was really useful, that outline too around the relationship between FAIR and open, and how those things aren't exactly the same thing, but they often point in the same direction. And I think we're in the same situation with CARE, where it isn't the same thing, but it's still pointing in the same direction, which is looking at, how can we reuse data? How can we do it in an appropriate manner? And how do we create value and benefit for our community? Thanks, Steph. So as we've started to think about what a careful process would look like, the aim of this is going to be to look at what sorts of criteria and methodology are necessary for that. But its purpose really being to enhance Indigenous participation in data governance, to ensure Indigenous values are included in data access protocols, and those things can really only come about if there's some way of recognising Indigenous data within these open data environments. Unless we can distinguish it in some fashion within a database, there's no way to then decide how people can be involved in that process. But the key, and some of the key outcomes we'd see from there is how do we increase the level of transparency and integrity around the use of Indigenous data. And part of that will be ensuring that there's some recognition around its provenance as it travels through systems over time. Next slide. So what we've started to do, and this is really just early thinking, is starting to look at what sorts of mechanisms might be used to support the operationalizing of care or particular principles within particular care principles. So you'll see here we've been thinking about what sorts of principles would Indigenous data governance support, where do institutional guidelines have a place, how might notices or labels be used to recognize where Indigenous data is sitting, how do data access protocols and tribal guidelines enhance or demonstrate what sorts of ethical processes might be included and support people with the responsibility for making decisions about where information ends up, and the role of tribal codes and tribal institutional review boards in terms of the authority they can exert. And I think these things, there's going to be given a whole range of different contexts around which you can find Indigenous data, different types, different places. There's going to be a range of different mechanisms that will support this coming about. Next slide. And so one of the things we're needing to think about and really needing support around this kind of thing is what other sorts of mechanisms are at place in other parts of the data ecosystem, and how might those mechanisms be indigenized, whether that's the inclusion of Indigenous values within ethical frameworks. And the examples that I've provided here are ones that I'm familiar with because they're here in New Zealand. And that's where a sort of a Māori ethical principles have been included as part of national ethical standards for health and disability. How Indigenous ethics can be included within data access protocols. And we have an example here with the Ngā Tikanga Paehere framework, which is to get access to data from the integrated data infrastructure. And then also Indigenous participation within governance or data access committees. So different ways in which Indigenous participation can be enhanced. Next slide. And so out of some of the conversations that we've had so far with our collaborators in this webinar, been really thinking about what are the places where care might be used. And so there's a little bit of a difference in the context of how FARE and care work together. And part of the conversation was, once data's been collected, as it's been curated and put together, you want to put it together in a way that meets the principles of FARE. But because of the people-orientated nature of care, it often means being involved across a broader process of collection and creation and reuse. And so thinking about how we might practice care and data collection, what does that mean in terms of defining cultural metadata or ensuring you record the provenance of that data? Once you're engaging with care in a data curation space, what sort of participation sits there in terms of governance models and ensuring that we can make data fair? And then when you're implementing care in the data communities, is that the place where Indigenous ethics inform access, and what sorts of tools can be used to support these ideas of transparency, integrity, and provenance? Ultimately, with this view that data, as much as possible, is becoming fair and care. Next slide. And so that has been part of our conversation, is thinking what that looks like. So I'll hand over to Edith for a few thoughts as well.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. So I think that the two-day workshop has to be a bit more interactive. Therefore, I put together a few questions which we might wish to discuss. Stephanie, we can go to the next slide, please. So how to include the care principles in the data? The Indigenous communities have a right to decide on the use of the data, but this right, while has to be respected, in no way should lead to exclude the data from other data sets, because it would be the biased approach if the care data would left aside and would not be used. So I think that after the similar to personal data and GDPR, now the community principle should be an added level of the data quality. So I think that, or I hope that we all agree that care is a very high added value and it shouldn't be excluded from the fair management in the future. We can go to the next page. I see it a bit as Shelly described, that the care principle is more part of the open, it's more a continuum, while the fair principle is a kind of gradually achievable approach. You have to find, access, interoperable, and reuse your data. And it's a kind of technological process, while the other one is more a policy, open open policy. So I just wanted to make this clear on this picture. And now I'd like to go to the questions which we put together. So if we look care and fair, I decided to put them to the 4 different groups because the data can be non-care, non-fair, or care but non-fair, care and fair, fair but not care. And I really wish that we would know that where is the data today. I guess that most likely the data is non-care and non-fair at this stage, but I would be really interested to your view. Therefore, if you don't mind to use your chat box and to use the order of 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you would give your estimate in percentage that where do you think that the data is today. So the number should be the total 100. And I just wonder what the people think that where is the data. So I give you a few minutes to put it to the chat box. We will use the chat box afterwards. So once again, just the percentage in the order 1, 2, 3, 4. Where do you think the data is today?
Andrew has asked the question, which data do you mean? The data that we work with ourselves?
I guess so. Interesting. Yeah, it seems that the data. Yeah, we are in the. I just wanted to prove by this small exercise that we are in the very right moment to start to go for care and fair together, because none of them is done. Yeah, so we have the great opportunity to do it together and to move directly from 3 to 4 instead of going to either 1 or 4. Yeah, so. Some are working towards 4. Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think that we are on the common. Then we are in the common ground. The data at the moment is neither care, neither fair, and we can move to the next question. Thanks for your brainstorm. We will discuss only 1 or 2 from the cubes 1 to 4. So now I'd like to give you the opportunity that which boxes you wish to talk about it. So again, if you wish to discuss 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, please put this number to the chat box again.
Sorry, I zoned out. What was the question?
Yeah, the question was that I put questions for all the 4 options, but I think that tonight we will have...
it's right in front of me. Okay, yes, all right.
Yeah, so the question that which one you wish to more discuss, I think that the major number is number 2. So people wish to talk about the data which is care but not fair.
Yeah.
Fine for me. And now then we can move to the questions. So this is we put together the presentation, so you will see all the questions, and the questions will be available, of course, afterwards in the web page. You can see that I put to the upper corner the quadrat, and this is the question which we are not going to discuss because you decided on the other way, but maybe for the next time. So we can go to the question 2. And I'd like to ask you maybe to speak up and to use also to use the chat box.
Sorry, Edith. In the numbering we had before, fair and care together was number 2. So I think probably the numbers.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So that would then be 3 again.
So then it would be 3.
No, one further. That's the one. Yes.
I think that, oh, sorry. Oh.
Yeah, that's all right.
So high-level questions that how the researchers can promote their methods to others. What are the top research fields where it is critical to have both care and fair principles, and how we can promote the two together? Yeah, I think that we have the problem with the promotion of both, actually, because we are in the other quadrant. So how we move? What would you think? And where should we start? What should be the top research fields? Maybe this is the first question to look at it. So I wouldn't mind if you would use again the chat box to write a short answer to all the three questions, or you can take the floor. Actually, you can use the microphone and you can be provocative to give ideas that how you would wish to move. I'm absolutely sure that myself that the FAIR community is not very well aware of the care principles. So I think that in the FAIR working group we can talk about the care principles a bit more. But it's just another idea. But I'm interested that what do you think that how we can move to care and FAIR together in one step?
Edith, this is Shelly. I wonder if we could consider for this discussion the care principles applying even more broadly than, as opposed to thinking of it as something that only happens with Indigenous data. Could we look towards more any community benefit, any community that's giving of their time, their knowledge, such that maybe we might have a broader adoption possibility.
Thank you, Shelly. That was we are on the same page because, you know, coming originally from Hungary, in the region, the big issue is for minorities. We don't have indigenous population in Europe, but we have a lot of minorities who might have the similar approaches, and they would be more listened to that word, the minorities in Europe, than for the indigenous group, but they have the same issue. So yes, one way could be that we promote the care principles beyond the indigenous working group, but I really would ask the others to tell what do they think. Yeah. We have something in the chat. So just to read you, Ruth says that I would appreciate having the care issues applied to my communities. Ruth, can I ask what is your community?
Well, okay, actually there's multiple communities depending on the dimensions I was thinking of. Right at the moment, I would consider myself to be, I live in Colorado, and specifically Westminster. So Westminster is my city, and it has, you know, its data issues as well. For example, I recently discovered that actually cell phone information got sold to the city so that they could figure out better bus routes, which is fine, but what else could you use that for? So there's a lot of communities and a lot of issues, and having this apply more broadly, in other words, having people have to actually think about these sorts of ethical issues when they're collecting data and making it available, I think would be extremely useful.
Thank you, Ruth. It's interesting to see in the chat box, meanwhile, that there are conflicting opinions. Some people say that, yes, more care principle would be good for more communities, while others argue that maybe then the indigenous discussion would be kind of disappearing if we would move care for other communities. Yeah.
I think this is Mark Parsons.
Hi, Mark.
Rensselaer Polytechnic, not Indigenous. I think this is a fraught path. I think it's really important to consider underrepresented perspectives, and we might want to think about that as something to take on. But in my mind, that's not what the care principles are about, even though we should be caring for all. And then I think that there's value in this Indigenous perspective that's not just because it's a minority perspective, it's because it's a durable and time-tested perspective. So I fear we would be diluting what the original intent was. And I think really it's up to Stephanie and Maui and other Indigenous people to speak to this more coherently. Over. Thank you.
So yeah, so if I just add a little piece on there, there's I think there's a little bit of a distinction we can make between the care principles themselves and how they've emerged from sort of an Indigenous view, and then how they might apply to Indigenous data, being the data associated with Indigenous communities, and then how they might apply to other sorts of data. So, and whether that's, often when we're talking about wanting to apply care to scientific data, we're still talking about it in the context of that sort of information as it relates to our community. But if there are other communities that could see the ways in which those things would support, then I don't see that as necessarily being a problem. It's going to depend a lot on what the mechanisms are. So the mechanisms that allow for the operationalizing of those principles will be key to that. And so certainly, would be advocating for Indigenous participation in any kind of mediated or kind of data governance, data access processes. That doesn't negate the possibility of other groups making use of those same sorts of mechanisms to, realize a same sort of intent. I think it will, as that, where the tension will emerge is when there's, as the different sort of layers of those things come together, and whether some of the Indigenous communities feel like their voice gets negated in that process as other voices are brought into the mix.
This is Stephanie. I would caution too that I think moving into a mainstream application too quickly will negate any benefits, and I put this in the chat, that would be accrued through leading with Indigenous innovation. So some of those mechanisms that Maui is mentioning or alluding to would not even become realized without continuing to focus on the Indigenous rights and interests perspective. And some of this comes from the background of the work that we do is around, we live in an era or time where most Indigenous perspectives, as well as other marginalized populations, have been, their knowledge systems have been suppressed or co-opted. And if we continue to quickly shift from Indigenous perspectives to mainstream perspectives, we continue that. And the end result is we all lose out, I think.
Stephanie and all, let me then adjust what I said, and I'm completely supporting this conversation, and feel I need to correct, adjust our trajectory, correct my intent. Let's come back and sit and be with the care principles as they are designed, and see in our minds a possible other interpretation that non-Indigenous communities could benefit from, but start clearly where you've put the time, and the benefit will be important, and your community is leading here, and we should recognize that and support you. So let me adjust and put us back on the original trajectory, and sorry I got us off track.
But maybe if I may add what I think that is that I think it could be a wonderful thing if the Indigenous initiative would get the global branding. Yeah, I think it would be a global recognition of the Indigenous community to bring a global brand, the care principle, to the world, which could be valuable for cities, but definitely in Europe for minorities, the minority groups, which is a kind of Indigenous people. Yeah, the people who live very long time in the same place. Meanwhile, the borders have moved in Europe, the people were staying there, and therefore the changing borders had impacted their lives. So I think that if the Care and Fair logo would go and fly around the world, it would be a wonderful recognition of the Indigenous community, which is less known in some parts of the world. So I think the global branding has some added value. But maybe we just have to move further. Yeah, have to move further. Maybe the one way could be also that that the care principle or the Indigenous communities could be the very first to run the testing for the FAIR principle. I think that the testing would be also a good option to go for care and fair. So it could initiate either from the care communities to go for fair, or from the fair communities to try the care principles. It should be both ways.
Edith, could I comment on what you just said? There's an interesting perspective, and for instance, you know, the moment in time where we evaluate FAIR, the data is in the repository, it's got all of its metadata, the research is either complete or has completed a phase, and we have a moment in time where we say, is it fair? And we can really benefit because it's pretty, you know, when do you evaluate FAIR? Well, you know, you can argue you should evaluate it all the way along, but most of the work is done at the very end. And the care principles are really different. We really have to, and I'm going to use words that, and I'm glad Judith's here because maybe she can chime in, but you really have to think, when you're starting to think about what sort of research you want to do and who that would involve, the care principles come in right away with how you conduct your research and permeate through the entire process. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that perspective, because it's very different. Like yeah.
Hello, everyone. This is Judith Ungwari. I'm here representing the Belmont Forum, that is an organization funding transdisciplinary research, and oftentimes in many different projects includes stakeholders who are coming from the Arctic, for example, in 2 different programs, Indigenous communities from many different places in the world. It's a global organization, so I wouldn't want to exclude any regions. It's to the point that Shelly was raising, I just wanted to add that from the principles perspective, from our funding organization, this evaluation of care and fair starts at the application level. So the moment a research consortium or a team submits an application, part of the proposal process is evaluating how they are doing in terms of trying to get to fair and get to care to their to the best of their abilities. We are very much aware that most of the data is in that quadrant of non-care and non-fair, but we want the researchers and the teams to be thinking from that, from the onset, from the proposal preparation moment, how they are trying to reach to these levels. So in terms of thinking about the entire life cycle of a project and the data and how it lives in the life cycle of the project and what happens with it after a project finishes, we thrive to incorporate the principles from the onset and then think about them as living documents in their data management plans and updating them and thinking about them throughout the entire project. So just from the funder's perspective, the one thing I wanted to add is that funders are paying attention to that, and more and more we see it on all different institutional levels, that they are requesting it from proposal level all the way to end-term valorization events and ends of project life cycles to see what is the proof out there that they tried to achieve the principles. Thanks.
Thanks, Judith. Stephanie, maybe Mike can go to the next questions.
This is Mark again. I just want to comment that I think there's a distinction between trying to consider all the ethical aspects of FAIR and the perspectives of Indigenous communities on care. And we shouldn't try and get too broad.
Thank you, Mark. We understood this.
So yeah, so Mark, yeah, I think in discussing that, I think we've come to that sort of agreement that it would at this point probably be valuable to focus on the Indigenous side of things, especially. I did want to come back to one question you put back in the chat a bit further back, and that was whether FAIR and CARE are at odds with each other or whether they're complementary. And I think it's, actually there is a risk in making all data blindly fair, and especially because it's all about machine readability and making sure that data can be used for all sorts of purposes and pulled together for all sorts of purposes. And especially in the context of Indigenous data, there are huge risks there. And I think having, and Maui's point that CARE is complementary to FAIR, I completely support, because I think especially in the context of Indigenous data, you need those checks and balances on top of it so that you don't have blindly fair data that any machine can pick up and use and misinterpret, but rather have a CARE process in design, in research design and research execution to make sure that it is ethically appropriately done and the community has a say in how the data is used and how it is interpreted. So I think that's where those two are definitely complementary. But I think one of the challenges as we were preparing for this session, we did realize that, as Shelly pointed out, that it's actually in different stages. FAIR is when you get to the end and you produce a data set, you can make that FAIR, and that's to one nice point in time. But the next step is actually picking up that data, using it or reusing it, and that's where CARE comes in. So if you want to do a framework that assesses both the fairness of the data set, but also how carefully it is being adopted, when do you assess that? How do you assess that? Is that something that can be combined, or would you have to do that in completely different times? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I think those are really good questions, and it raises all sorts of thoughts. So one, I think in terms of thinking about the ethics of FAIR, so we've heard about the idea of having fairer, where E and R are ethics and responsibility. And so those ethics might not be directly related to Indigenous concerns. I mean, we've heard about machine learning approaches affecting recidivism assessments and overly penalizing Black people in America in terms of prison sentences. And so these are not Indigenous people, but they're people that we should care about. That's important. That's something that we need to worry about. I think as we're thinking about ethical concerns, though, what we're trying to do with the CARE principles is really focus on that Indigenous aspect. And I guess sort of to just turn your question around into more questions, because I just feel like I'm swimming in this, is that, you know, can we start to think about a care maturity, just like y'all have been thinking about a fair maturity? And on the flip side, as we're assessing fair maturity, what does fair mean in an Indigenous context? And, you know, Indigenous people use machines too. But so how would that approach? So maybe thinking about it in that way. I don't know if that really answered your question, Keith, but these are the things that are swimming around in my brain.
Stephanie, may I ask you to go to the next slide, because this question which Mark has mentioned, one more.
Well, while we find the slide, how about I just have
Yeah.
a
No. That was the previous one, because the question was that how we can go to the care maturity criteria and what the lessons can be learned maybe from the fair maturity criteria process. I think that Mark raised a very important question, that our experience in the fair maturity working group was that while we were all loved the FAIR principles, they were finally not so clear as we originally talked, and it was very difficult, long process to agree the criteria from the FAIR principles. So maybe it is the same way for the care principles to move towards the criteria. And the question then for the FAIR intergroup, or for the FAIR working group, that can some of the process and some of the steps in our process be used for getting to the care maturity criteria. But the first question here, that, and maybe it would be interesting to use the chat box again, how many of you think that the care maturity criteria has to be produced, and how many of you think that the care principles are just sufficient and we do not need to go for a maturity criteria on care?
Edith, pardon me as I blurt this out. The one thing to consider is, and I'm remembering part of our conversation from a couple of days ago, the care principles have yet to have an assessment methodology. So we may want to have an interim step here. Yes, maturity would be interesting, but we really need to have a clear understanding of what it means to actually be caring. We'll have to work on our acronyms, but or how we say our acronyms. But yes, to be caring. So what would that assessment look like? And you could jump ahead. You could think through assessment and criteria at the same time, but that might be a little too much to bite off in one working group.
And if I just sort of add a point here, I think with there's been this identification of how care, because it's people orientated, works across a sort of a broad, potentially works across a broader spectrum, and that it supports the kinds of practices that are being advocated for in other places, whether it's better engagement, kind of CBPR, these sorts of relationships that will exist between researchers and communities in the generation of data. So the care principles, I think a shift from the principles into the criteria is about helping locate those notions into actually the data infrastructures and the data systems themselves. So, whether these are the sorts of metadata that are required or are useful to help you then be able to do these other activities. These are the things that you should see within the kind of data access protocols or governance. So it becomes more system, how we shift from the what we're trying to get as an outcome in terms of the relationships between the people, but it's actually enabled through the systems that we've put in place and the environment that's put in place. And the criteria can relate to those things rather than the principles of the people.
That's great, Maui, but I have a real hard time getting my head around how that would actually work, you know? I mean, I think you're on the right track, but it's like, you know, what are those things that those systems have to pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, we tried to highlight a few of the ones that we're thinking about. You know, we didn't necessarily talk about it, but on that stream, we're initiating some conversations with standards organisations, thinking about what does an Indigenous provenance data standard look like. You know, if we can find ways to ensure that, you know, whether it's ethnicity or race and those things being kept alongside administrative data sets, whether it's provenance standards alongside kind of traditional knowledge or scientific data or gene sequences. I think there's these different things that are different conversations that are starting to emerge, and we're really just needing to try and surface those and see how could they be applied more generally across other places.
Okay. Yeah, so I know just what little work I've done with in Indigenous knowledge is that it's so important to know who said what. And different people interpret the value of who said what differently, you know. Oh, that person, oh yeah, they really know what they're talking about. Oh no, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. But and I'm maybe I'm sort of trivializing that, but somehow capturing that context is really critical.
Maui, there was a comment that came up in a prep conversation that we were having. I'm wondering if you can expand on it a little bit, that some Indigenous data isn't even identified as being Indigenous data. And that seems like maybe that might be one of like a fundamental element to figure out.
Well, maybe I can pass that on to one of the other people here, Jane Anderson. I see she's here as well, and a lot of that conversation had been based on work she was doing and what she's noticed.
Thanks for that, Maui. I think I was just adding that within the enormous collections that are in archives, museums, libraries, universities around the world that hold both science-based collections, but also other kind of cultural heritage collections, actually identifying Indigenous data in those contexts is very, very difficult. It was never recorded as being Indigenous data. Indigenous interests aren't even in the recognised in the cataloguing systems. So for Indigenous communities to find that is very, very difficult. So in my experience of working in these contexts, largely almost all Indigenous data is not fair. You can't find it, it's not accessible, it's not interoperable, and it's not reusable in any way. So kind of thinking about that becomes really important in terms of what the tools are that need to be developed, and then kind of how CARE supports doing that work as well.
Stephanie here as well. There's another really good example as well is, say, for instance, in national infrastructures that, say, for instance, in Australia, we have the Atlas of Living Australia, which is our national biodiversity. You know, we have scientific names, but we have minimal Indigenous language names. So how do you actually give prominence to Indigenous worldviews? And, you know, language is an important part of those. So, you know, in those data systems, you can actually really make a massive change by incorporating some Indigenous values and knowledges in those systems.
This is Stephanie Carroll. We've seen the same issues in human-based data, so both in health data and in, for instance, justice system data here in the US. And so it wasn't until recently, probably the past month, that you were able to get data on violence against women at a federal level that was being collected with, or had any indication of indigeneity within it. And so it's an issue across the board and across sectors.
A question to Stephanie and Maui and team. We have this concept of a domain repository, and I know it doesn't hold all the way around the world. Like I know Australia doesn't really have domain repositories, but we look at them as this is our atmospheric data, this is our seismology data. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about it for Indigenous data. Does it tend to always be coupled? Does it stand on its own, or does it tend to be coupled, or both? Could you sort of help at least me think about that?
Yeah, first.
Shelly, can you say a little bit more about coupled with what? What do you mean, just in terms of how it's being coupled? Like, are you talking about, yeah, maybe you could just clarify a little bit about what you mean by that coupling.
Well, this idea, and I might be going down a rabbit hole, but I'll give it a go. So certain types of data, we want data to land in domain repositories to make it easier for us to find it, to make it easier for it to be aggregated with other similar types of data, for studies that would include contributed data sets from multiple researchers, et cetera. So there's this concept of, if it all comes to this one curation location, that this data manager, this curation specialist who understands that kind of data, it has a better shot at being well documented and meeting community criteria. And I'm asking concerning Indigenous data, because I'm not familiar with how it's captured and stored. So it's very much a basic question, I hope, maybe not. You can really apply, you can really say that any type of scientific data that exists today could have an Indigenous component to it, depending on where, how, who, there's probably some more words, that data was collected. So I guess I may have just answered my own question, that no matter where data is stored, it could very well have an Indigenous component to it, and we should consider that as a education point to apply curation criteria, and then everything else having to do with care, the provenance, as Maui had mentioned earlier, and perhaps you did too, Jane. Is that enough to let you go a little further?
Yeah, so so the principle, you know, and I think this is a kind of interesting thing about being involved with you know, setting principles and then trying to have them operationalized, is you can end up focusing on them as much as the purpose. And I think there's, you know, Mark's made a couple of comments about just the, you know, the situational aspect of how these things might play out, given that you do have all sorts of different domains, you do have all sorts of different places where things can operate. So it's going to be, you know, localized in a lot of ways. Those two themes of data for governance, so being able to access data. So if this is about how do we ensure that data can benefit Indigenous communities, then one part is around making sure they can access it. So whether they're wanting to access, say, some cultural heritage material that's sitting in a museum or an archive, that will support, you know, some particular activities they're doing. It might be accessing some atmospheric or environmental information to support them with some sort of restoration, sustainability type initiative. Then the ability to access that wherever it is, whatever the domain, whatever the repository is, becomes that sort of principle. In the same way, also then, at what times is it possible or appropriate for them to be involved in the governance of other people's use of that data? You know, that's going to play out in a kind of a whole variety of different ways, depending on the relationship they can generate as their nation, as their tribal nation, with the nation state or with the place which holds those things. And I think these relationships are becoming, at one level, more complicated because you're getting data aggregated into different sort of domains and repositories, the same information. And so that at one level, that makes it more complicated. At another level, it makes it easier because if you can engage with the Atlas of Living Australia, that sort of aggregating body, you can put in place fields within those systems that make it easier for that information to then be represented and for that, you know, to become findable for those Indigenous communities, whether it's the information that's their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge information, or whether it's the thing that links it to the science information, which they might find adds value to what they know about their place as well.
So one of the things I heard you say was, so an aspect of finding of Indigenous data meant likely a tool could hunt it down. So I think somebody in the chat had indicated that if Earth observations, for instance, all had GIS location, you could associate that with particular tribal land or something of interest to an Indigenous people. So that would give you, so it would be really interesting to perhaps walk through that operationalization with care as the base and then walking the FAIR elements to benefit care. The other one that popped up was, you used the word governance, and it connected in my mind to usage licenses and ownership of data. So two different legal aspects, which are fraught with, the average person does not can get their head around how challenging it is to define who the owner is of data, and then the complexities of usage rights. So we would have to open that box with help. So if it's data associated with an Indigenous community picked up by a satellite or whatever other instrument, it's how do we identify, how can we teach our researcher community to know they have to get permission and give them a way to do it, a process. And then what's that, you know, ongoing engagement and ongoing management. That would be worthy to figure out. I mean,
yeah, Shelly, I think some of the interesting things are, there's a couple, so Jane in one of her classes, and then another colleague of mine, actually Desi Rodriguez-Lonebear, who you've met, so have been talking about how to create algorithms, right, to detect Indigenous data, whether it be in collections or human data or what have you, but also working through some of those issues that about how you basically train and inform people to be able to include metadata for that provenance, right, and the importance of that. I want to recognize that we're almost at the end of our time here. My children have reminded me.
I'll just make one more comment just on the basis of that too. So just sort of, I guess, a little bit of a closing comment as well. So through GIDA, we are at the moment starting to talk about what does the nature of rights and interests look like in relation to data for Indigenous people. So, you know, when you're thinking about, you know, you can think about a right that emerges, or a proprietary interest which gets consolidated as a right, whether it's an intellectual property right or an ownership in some sort of ways. But there's all these other sorts of rights and interests which can get expressed through use, consent, privacy, these sorts of things. And we're just trying to work out at the moment what the sort of those rights and interests, because it's really easy to talk about in a general sense that there are these things, but being sort of specific about what those look like and then how they might apply to different contexts. So I think that's, we're starting to explore what that might look like, and if we end up with some particular case studies, I think that will be one of the things we'll try and do.
My conclusion would be that I think that it would be good if the indigenous communities would make a test with the fair, because we could probably identify the questions by doing the test. So maybe that would be the practical solution towards. And I do hope that we will be able to work together to get a win-win situation instead of the lose-lose situation in the future. So that would be my learning for today. And I really much thanks for the presence. We had 37 people in the certain moment, which is a very, very good number, I think. So thanks very much for all the contributions, and I hope that we make a post meeting to make the summary and make the report available in the webpage of the two working groups, I hope.
Thank you all, and sadly, pity we were not able to do this in Melbourne face to face, but I think this was a great way to continue this conversation. And thank you all for your thoughts and inputs. And I found it a really valuable and interesting discussion, bringing all these different perspectives together and having a chance to take it further. And there's still a long way to go, but I think really interesting. Thank you all.
All right, well, yeah, and for me to say thanks everyone for finding time to join us today. Hope the rest of your day goes well, however short or long that is. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversations and just creating space for people to be a part of it. If you've got kind of bright ideas, you know, we're working on things as we can, but we know that those possibilities emerge from a variety of places. So always appreciate advice or thoughts from people. So kia ora koutou.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Have a great day, great night, good night, bye.
Thanks.
Ciao, gracias, thank you.